Okay, we are going to finish up Daniel tonight. We're in Daniel chapter 12, and I know there are some first-time students in here tonight because the college class is not meeting tonight, so many of them are in here. So we are finishing up the book, and I want to try to make some sense in putting this end in some perspective of what's been going on in Daniel. Daniel 9 and Daniel 10 through 12, two different visions, separated by a couple of years. Daniel 9 occurs in the first year of Darius. Daniel 10 through 12 occurs in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So there's a couple of years difference here. But I do believe there's an association between the two. I think what we have in 10 through 12 is more of an elaboration on 9 than I believed to begin with, but in my studies, I really think that's what's going on. So I want to go back and just kind of notice something here in Daniel 9. If you recall, this is at the end of what Daniel came to understand was the period of captivity. He understood this from the writings of Jeremiah the prophet. And so he does what God has said his people should do. That when they were punished, if they would return to Him, if they would admit their iniquity and their guilt and repent, then God would restore them. And so Daniel has done this in Daniel chapter 9. And at the conclusion of that prayer, Daniel asks God to hear and to respond. And so he says in verse 19, O Lord, hear, O Lord, forgive, O Lord, listen and take action for your own sake, O my God. Do not delay, because your city and your people are called by your name. Daniel did exactly as he should. He brought all this back to the glory of God, and he asked God to take note of what's going on, and particularly for God's people and God's city, Jerusalem, because these were called by His name. And so a messenger is sent to Daniel. Gabriel is sent to Daniel. And this prophecy of the 70 weeks or 77s, however you want to look at that, is given. And that prophecy has to do with 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and for your city. Remember, that's what Daniel has ended his prayer in requesting. God hear, God forgive, for your people and your city that are called by your name. And so God responds, well, here is a 77 prophecy that are about the people and the city. And there were going to be some good things that happened at that time. There was going to be the restoration of the city. There was going to be the coming of the Messiah. But how does that 77s end? What's the status of God's people at that time? What's the status of the Messiah? Messiah is cut off. Let's see, did I put this on the screen? Nope, I didn't. So we'll come back. In Daniel 9, 26 and 27, Messiah is cut off. Sanctuary is destroyed. Things are not good for the city and for the nation of Israel. When you come to chapter 10, a vision now is sent to Daniel. Daniel would understand what would happen in regards to his people, what would happen in the days in the future. And I really do think that 10 through 12 is elaborating on what that 77s talked about in very brief period. Yes, there's a restoration of God's people to Jerusalem, but that occurred in times of tribulation. And then there's going to be a coming time when the city itself was destroyed, Messiah is cut off. So we won't go back through all what we've already read in chapter 11. I will simply make the point again that I believe anyway there is a change in verse 36 of chapter 11 to, again, kind of bring it into agreement or harmony with Daniel 9. That cutting off of the Messiah, that destroying of the sanctuary happens within the time of the Roman Empire. And I think in chapter 11 you had that shift from Greece to the Roman Empire, and how chapter 11 is concluding is talking about events that was happening to the Jews, to Daniel's people at that time. So, Daniel 12 picks up there. And Daniel 12 starts talking about what's happening at the end. And this idea of the end occurs 4 times in chapter 12. It's found in verse 4, it's found in verse 6, it's found in verse 9, it's found in verse 13. So clearly that's something of importance in this chapter. And if we're just reading it straight through, we're going to come to some assumptions. If you just read this and you come to verse 4, and when Daniel is told to conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time, well, of course, what do we think? We're thinking the end of the earth. We're thinking the end of time. Okay? Well, what has Daniel looked forward to thus far? How far out in the future have the visions and prophecies of Daniel extended? To Rome. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Rome. Daniel 9, the 77's prophecy, Rome. I again think in chapter 11, we come to the time of Rome. You don't see any extension further than that. And so I do believe that is kind of defining the end for us. In other words, the end of what God has been showing to Daniel. And so even in verse 6, notice how the end is termed there. One asks the man who is clothed in linen, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? And that kind of helps define that for us. We're not looking at the end that's going to happen some few thousand years in the future, but rather all these wonders that God has been describing and prophesying in this book, when is the end of that? And I think that's the end that we're speaking about in our class tonight and in chapter 12. So, what's happening at this time of the end? Well, first there's distress. Verse 1, and we'll come back to Michael here in a second. But in verse 1, God says, at that time, remember, we're just continuing what's being talked about in chapter 11. There's no break as Daniel is revealing this vision. So at that time, at the time when those events are occurring at the end of chapter 11, again, I believe speaking of Rome, and what it says in verse 45, Rome, who even though their end is appointed, and there's not going to be anybody that can help them, yet they are encamped in the Holy Land. They've pitched their tent there, which again coincides with what we understand of their oppression of the Jews in the first century. So at that time, there's going to be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. Daniel has been concerned about his people, and God's bringing him to the end of what's happening to his people in a national sense. And there's going to be a time of distress like there's never been. Interestingly, Ezekiel uses a little similar language when speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, so even before something that already happened before this prophecy. But when God reveals through Ezekiel in chapter 5 and verse 8, even I am against you, and I'll execute judgments among you in the sight of the nations, and because of all your abominations, I'll do among you what I have not done, and the like of which I will never do again. So it's this language that's being used to describe the utmost destruction that can occur. Well, now we're being told there's going to be a time of distress like has never occurred before. Our Lord in Matthew 24 and verse 21, and he's gone back, you go back to verse 15 of this chapter, and he even references the abomination of desolation which Daniel described. And by the way, Daniel, in speaking of that, uses that terminology 4 times in the letter. Sometimes it refers to Antiochus Epiphanes. Sometimes, I think in the 70 weeks vision, it's not about Antiochus. It is about what Rome does. But the Lord uses that as a reference and then says in Matthew 24 and verse 21, there will be a great tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Well, what event is the Lord talking about in Matthew 24? You remember, his disciples had been showing him the buildings of the temple, how beautiful they were. Jesus has said, I tell you, not one stone is going to be left on top of another. And they want to know, when is this going to happen? So Jesus is talking about various signs that precede that, and then says, using the words of Daniel, this is the time of distress like has never occurred before, nor ever will. So I do believe that's what Daniel is looking forward to there in Daniel chapter 12. So there's this distress, but there's also hope. Michael is brought back here, but it's not the first time we've read about Michael. When else do we read about Michael? Anybody remember? Chapter 10. And remember, there's this divine messenger that had been sent to Daniel when Daniel first began to mourn. But Daniel had been mourning for a period of 21 days. Why was it that that divine messenger was delayed? Who opposed him? Prince of Persia, and then there was a prince of Greece coming along as well. And the divine messenger said, only Michael, your prince, stood with me. So here's Michael, this representative of God and His people who fights in the spiritual realm, if you will, for God's people. Well, Michael rises. So you have this idea, distress is going on. That's what's happening to God's people on earth, and yet here is Michael, and he rises. Well, that's because, yes, God's people are being distressed, but there is still deliverance. And according to verse 1, that deliverance is for those who are found written in the book. They are going to be rescued. So this idea of the book of life, which certainly figures into various New Testament passages. Interestingly, back in the 7th chapter in verse 10, when that 4th world empire is about to be judged, it talks about how the books were opened. So you have this idea of books being opened in Daniel. In chapter 7, books are opened and then judgment ensues. Chapter 12, books are opened and those who have been faithful to God, they're rescued. So again, distress such as has never occurred before, but those who are faithful to God, rescue. Michael has arisen. Michael is still fighting for them and on their side. Let's go a little bit further, and then I'll pause for any questions and comments. So then in verse 2, many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, and the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Well, certainly, again, we would be tempted to see this has got to be talking about the end of time, because that's when the resurrection occurs. John 5, verses 28 and 29, I do think Jesus speaks of a resurrection to come at the end. A resurrection much like in the terminology here, where the righteous are raised to life, the wicked are raised to judgment and condemnation. But Jesus also spoke of another kind of resurrection in John chapter 5. John chapter 5 and verse 25, Jesus said, truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and now is when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God and those who hear will live. What kind of resurrection is Jesus talking about there? A spiritual one. Here are God's people oppressed, downtrodden, defeated. Yet at that time, Jesus walking among them, proclaiming the good news of God, those who heard him, Jesus said, they're raised up to life. I'm giving them life. Of course, even though it's not in the passage here, what are those who refused him? Death, destruction, even the total annihilation of Jerusalem that would occur at the hand of the Romans. So I would again think that's what Daniel is speaking of, or what is being revealed to Daniel in Daniel chapter 12. At that time, this great distress, but also at that time, there's going to be life. There's going to be resurrection. When Jesus says, an hour is coming, it had been predicted, but the hour now is. The dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear it will live. All right, real quickly, let's just go through the rest of the first 4 verses. Speaking again of those who are raised to life, in verse 3, those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, those who lead the many to righteous like the stars forever and ever. And then verse 4, as for you, Daniel, conceal these words, seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. We've made this point before. I would, if you haven't considered it already, just contrast this with what John is told to do in Revelation 22 and verse 10, where John is told, don't seal up the vision. John's told not to seal up the vision because the time is near. I think Daniel is referring to events from that time that are going to happen in the next 500 to 700 years, depending on where you kind of want to mark that off. If you want to mark it all off with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, then you're looking at a little over 500 years. If you want to go further out to when Rome is itself, punished and judged, as Revelation would describe, you're, add a couple more hundred years to that. So Daniel's looking at events 500 to 700 years down the road, and Daniel is told, seal it up, conceal it. It's for the end of time. Again, the end of the time that God has been describing in Daniel. John, don't seal it up. Time is soon. So I don't think John is writing about events that were going to happen thousands and thousands of years down the road, events that we're still waiting on to occur, because you had that difference in the prophecies there. And then even the last phrasing, many will go back and forth and knowledge will increase. I don't have an exact understanding of that. Let's be honest. I don't know that I have an exact understanding of any of this. If you didn't know that already, well, you're warned now. I could be wrong about everything. So if you didn't have confidence in me before now, you certainly don't now. But the idea would seem to be there's going to be this frantic searching for understanding what's happening in the vision. There's going to be some gain in insight, some gain in knowledge, but there's not going to be, complete gain of knowledge because it's concealed. It's hidden. They're not going to know. So that's the first 4 verses. That's a lot. That's more in those first 4 verses than anything else in the rest of the chapter. So I'll pause here. Questions or comments, feel free. Yes, Joe. The ones that insight, verse 3, I believe are those who were raised in verse 2 to everlasting life. And again, if we're looking forward to the days of the Messiah, a day in which the Jews are distressed and will suffer that distress like none other, but those who hear his words are raised to life, they're the ones that now have insight. They're the ones that shine like the stars in the heavens. That's my understanding of it anyway. Good question. Any others? Comments?
Will the distress be as a result of the martyrs that were killed?
So the distress in this passage, and that's a good question, Sister Audrey. She asks, is the distress because of the martyrs that are killed? For instance, in Revelation, when God is going to pour out the bowls of wrath and the trumpets are sounded, and a lot of that's in response to the martyrs and their prayer, God, oh Lord, how long? When will you avenge us? So there is that. Matthew 24, when Jesus speaks of the destruction of Jerusalem, it's God's justice on Jerusalem for rejecting the Son of God. Now, granted, yes, in bringing into that, the prophets that have suffered and how the Jews have rejected all of God's messengers culminating with His Son, you could say in that sense, yes, but predominantly, you rejected my Son. And here is the destruction that comes on the city that Daniel's been praying for in response to their rejection of God's Son. Good question. Okay. Next few verses. Go back again. When? So in verses 5 and 6, we're introduced to a couple of others that I don't know have been introduced before. Some, when they read chapter 10, do think that there are multiple figures introduced in that chapter. We're only told of one for sure in chapter 10, and it's this man who's clothed in linen, who bears a lot of features, according to chapter 10, that would bring an association of him to God or with God. So that's why I've simply referred to him as the divine messenger. Don't know exactly who he is. We're not told who he is, but he has an association with God, and he was sent to bring a revelation to Daniel. Well, there are others. The man clothed in linen is above the river, and then there are others, one on either side of the river. And one asks the important question: when? When are these things going to take place? And I'm sure Daniel would like to know that too. When is all this happening? I've been so concerned with my people and the holy city, and you're saying all this is going to happen, and there's some really terrible things that are going to happen. So when is all this going to happen? So in verse 7, the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. Okay. Don't know that Daniel understood much of that. That idea of a time, times, and half a time had been introduced before back in chapter 7 and verse 25. Again, in that passage, the Fourth World Empire doing battle against God's people, exalting itself above Jehovah God, was also doing so for a time and times and half a time. Revelation in several chapters from 11 through 13, this time, times and half a time, 42 months, 1,260 days is referenced quite frequently. And all kind of looking at this same period of time, but the point is, it's not forever. It's defined, and it's not even extremely long. 42 months, 3.5 years, 1,260 days. It's a period of time. Things are going to be bad during that period of time, but it won't go on forever. I think that's the main point there. Now, I think there is one other connection with Revelation here. Revelation 10, and beginning in verse 5. The angel whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land lifted up his right hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things in it, and the earth and the things in it, and the sea and the things in it, that there would be delay no longer. But in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, the mystery of God is finished, as he preached to his servants the prophets. Again, how far into the future do the prophets look? Prophets don't look toward the end of time, not the way we think of it. The prophets look toward the end of the Jewish nation. The prophets look toward the time of the Messiah. They look toward the time of the establishment of God's kingdom. They look toward the time of the destruction of the world empire that was opposing God's kingdom. Daniel 12, you have this man clothed in linen raising his hands to heaven and swearing that it's going to be for a time and times and half a time. Revelation 10, you have a similar image, an angel standing over the water and over the land, raising his hand to heaven and swearing, now's the time that all that the prophets have prophesied is going to be fulfilled. The mystery of God is finished. Well, I think those two go hand in hand. What happens in that time, times, and half a time? That's the amount of time from the time of Daniel until God's mystery was going to be finished. And that was going to involve the coming of the Messiah. That was going to involve the destruction of Jerusalem. That was going to involve the punishing of God's people. That was going to involve the punishing of the world empire at that time. And so when you come to Revelation 10, now the angel is saying, it's about to be finished. Does that make sense? Does that connection make some sense to you between Daniel 12, Revelation 10, really throughout that whole section? You can't preach Revelation without going to Daniel a whole lot. Because there's a lot of carryover there. All right, so that's the win. And that's going to be over when the shattering of the holy people are accomplished. And again, you can use that as saying, okay, AD 70, destruction of Jerusalem, or you can even forecast that further out into what Revelation's talking about and how the world empire at that time was seeking to shatter God's people, seeking to shatter the early church. But the point being, this is going to happen for a defined period of time. It won't last forever. And then that period of time is going to be over. All right, we're running out of time, so let's just go ahead and go to the final exhortation here. Oops, sorry. I think we can relate to verse 8 a lot. As for me, I heard but could not understand. So I said, my Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? Who's ruling when Daniel receives this vision? It's the Persians. We haven't even gotten to the time of the Greeks, much less the time of the Romans. Jerusalem hasn't even been rebuilt yet, much less destroyed again. So you can imagine Daniel's confusion, Daniel being perplexed. I included in the material a quote from Homer Haley, and I think he has a centering idea there for us. Unless we ever begin to think we've got the end really figured out, I think we probably better put ourselves in the place of Daniel. Daniel's perplexed. I don't understand what's happening. Some things have been revealed to us about what's going to happen at the end. I don't think we've got it figured out, guys. I don't think we know everything. We know what's been revealed, but oftentimes we may be kind of perplexed about that too. We can have a shared experience with Daniel, if you will. Well, I'll come back to verse 9. Verses 10 through 12, again, just kind of makes this point about how the distress is going to occur. Daniel needs to understand there's going to be this time of distress. So many are purged, purified, refined. The wicked will act wickedly. None of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. So you've got this distress, but this distress also leads to a purifying of those who would have understanding. And so you have the punishment of many, but you have those who are going to come to understanding and those who are going to have life because of that. Verse 11, from the time the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination is set up, there will be 1,290 days. I do believe Daniel is referencing You know the events that were talked about in chapter 11 with Antiochus Epiphanes, and how at that time sacrifice was going to be forbidden, the abomination, the desecration of God's temple was going to occur. But the point was, from then going forward, until all of this is accomplished, 1,290 days. The best I can tell is that's just simply trying to give another number for the time times and half the time. I don't know why it's not the 1,260 that Revelation would use. I just don't know. But I think we're supposed to see the same thing there. This defined, not that long, but may seem long to us, that defined period of time, and it's going to start, God says, when the sacrifice is prohibited, when the abomination is set up, and from then you start counting. But, verse 12, how blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. I know of no significance to that number, except it's longer than 1,290. That's the only significance I know. The point being, those who've endured, those who went through the distress, went through the trials, those whom he talked about earlier are refined, gained insight. Those who stayed faithful, they're blessed. All right, real quickly. Both in verses 9 and 13, Daniel is given this instruction. Go your way. Think of all Daniel had just heard. And how perplexed, confused, anxious Daniel could have been. You read again the prayer of Daniel 9. Daniel cared for his people so very much. And he wanted them restored. And God has just said, for the most part, your people are going to suffer. And your people are going to go through distress like none other. Some are going to be raised to life. Some who endure throughout the 1,290 days and come to the 1,335 days, they're going to be blessed, but not all. The city that you love, destroyed. And Daniel's just told, go your way. Furthermore, in verse 13, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. For all that Daniel has seen, he only has such a small part in God's plan. He's such a small part in what's happening. So Daniel's just told, you go your way. And at the end of your time, you're going to have rest, and then finally reward. Take that back to the kind of the main point of the entire book. The main point of the entire book being the Lord Jehovah rules over the realm of mankind. Well, that's how Daniel can go his way. He knows, he understands, okay, all these things are going to happen, things I don't fully understand, and it's going to be bad. But Jehovah still rules over the realm of mankind. And so I can go my way, and at the end enter rest and receive reward. I think that's a much needed lesson for you and I today. So we consider the state of our world. We consider the uncertainty of our days. And yet Jehovah still rules over the realm of mankind. Our rest and reward are still there. And while we may have anxieties and concerns about those things, Jehovah would simply say, go your way. I still rule. go your way. And my friends, that's Daniel to the best of my ability. Questions, comments? We got really no time, but hey, I'm good at that. Kevin Floyd is mocking me somewhere. Yes, Eric.
It's a message, as you said, that is for us. Hope is not lost, even when it gets worse and worse. And that's the message throughout Daniel, and that's the message we see throughout the New Testament. Be faithful through the tribulation. And as you said, the righteous will be raised up and given their life place.
Yeah.
And you're right, it's a message that we need even today.
Oh, yeah. You know, you read, you basically reference Revelation 2:10. That's in some ways the same point that was being made about how blessed are the ones who make the 1335. You know, be faithful until death, I'll give you the crown of life. You're going to suffer tribulation. Satan's going to, throw some of you into prison. All these things. And that's a message that God's people needed in the first century, a message Daniel needed back then, a message we need today. All right. Yes, Paul.
Yeah, Romans chapter 8, verse 27, and I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business, for I was appalled by his vision and did not understand it. We look at Daniel as someone who's a person of faith and is a great example, but he was still unsettled by the things that took place around him. That doesn't mean that he didn't have faith in God. That just means that he observed the world around him and not being the way that it is. So when we have those feelings, I think we should be reminded that many of our heroes in the Bible were disturbed by the things that surround them, and that didn't make them any less faithful. So the term that they were faithful is what they did after a few days of being lost. What did they do next?
Yeah. Good point, Paul. We're looking at Daniel 8:27. And one of the things I see in Daniel is just, how, and particularly these last chapters, how humanized he is to us in these chapters. Not understanding, confused, appalled, sick because of what he sees. And so almost the whole gamut of human emotion, at least on one side of human emotion, of this faithful servant of God. And yet still at the end, go your way, Daniel. Your rest will be there. So. All right, that's our time. Thank you again so much. Next Wednesday night, come back here. You won't have to look at me anymore.